Well, again, hello everyone, and bonjour tout le monde. Welcome to Defining Your Role as a Fiduciary webinar. Today, we are going to explore some learnings from our friends from Leith Wheeler about the role and the responsibilities of a fiduciary for a community foundation. And we're gathered today for 1 hour. It is absolutely wonderful to have each of you joining us today. And thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedules. And I know that your work as a community foundation has many responsibilities. Today's webinar is very fitting for the responsibilities of each and every one of you. And so please feel free to take a moment to introduce yourself in the chat as we get ready to start today's webinar. And so I'm going to just run through a few items as we get ready to start. And I do apologize because all of a sudden my computer just went onto a freeze mode. And so just give me a second here and I will get myself back up here. Apologize again. We always prepare in advance. And as we know, sometimes those moments can happen where technology just takes us for a little jaunt. So for those of you I've not met, my name is Tracy Vaverick. And I am the Director of Learning and Network Engagement with the Community Foundations of Canada team. And I'm joining you today from my home in Calgary, Alberta, which is Treaty 7 territory on the traditional lands of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina, the Stoney Nakoda Nations, and Métis Nation. I am holding space for the learning journey that I am on. I am building my knowledge and strengthening my respect for reconciliation, and that my part is more than just offering a land acknowledgement. I grew up on Treaty 7 territory, and I am a settler, and I come with an openness to learn and understand the truth and honor the past and actively build an inclusive and caring future of peace, friendship, and understanding. And joining us today are community foundations that operate from coast to coast to coast. And while we may be connecting today from different locations, it is important to remember that we all have a responsibility to acknowledge the land and the original peoples of that place. And so I thank each of you for being with us today. And I hope you take a moment to consider your own connection to the land and the original caretakers of where you live. I also, again, express my deep appreciation to each of you for your commitment to explore ways to strengthen your foundation. So thank you again for joining us, and we're going to just move into a couple more housekeeping details. So just a friendly Zoom reminder, we are in meeting format today, so to ensure there's space for questions, it is important we have the time to hear your questions and have some dialogue together. So this does mean that we can see and hear you. Please keep yourself muted during the presentation, so this will allow for our presenters to share with their thoughtful connections with us and their thoughtful content. And so if you do have questions as we move through today's session, please pop them into the chat box. We will be incorporating and collecting your questions for a Q&A. So please note your questions are important to us, and that Q&A is a time where we can hold some reflections and some additional learning experiences. The webinar is being recorded, and the recording and the slides will be shared with you in a follow-up email. And I encourage each of you to share that recording with others on your team, from your finance teams to your treasurers, your board of directors, your board chairs, and all the other leaders within your organization. This session is available in both English and French, and to access the French and the English interpretation, you'll see a globe at the bottom of your screen. And if you click on that globe, you can switch between French and English. You will also be able to access the slide deck in both English and French. So if you go to the very top of your screen in the middle, you'll see View Options. And if you just toggle down and use the arrow that's beside the View Options, you'll see that a panel will appear. And under those shared screens, you're able to select either to view the English slides or the French slides. I am absolutely honored to now take us in today's webinar and to introduce you to some very dear friends of community foundations that operate from coast to coast to coast. And that is Dalyce Seitz and Michael Schaab, both from Leith Wheeler Investment Counsel. Both Dalyce and I'm going to use the word Mike because he's given me permission to do so, but both Dalyce and Mike are principals and portfolio managers with Leith Wheeler Investment Counsel. Today, we're going to draw on their experiences that they've had in managing discretionary portfolios for foundations and families. They're going to speak to us today further around what it means to be a fiduciary and the governance responsibilities. This team works with clients from across Canada, and Mike leads the foundations and the endowment group out of Vancouver, and Dalyce is based here in Calgary. And I enjoy when I have those moments to have tea with Dalyce here in Calgary. Leith Wheeler Investment Counsel has been part of Community Foundations of Canada's National Vital Signs and has been a partner since 2019. And we're very grateful for that partnership. They're also an independent money management firm that manages over $22 billion worth of assets for clients across Canada. So within that, they do a lot of work for foundations, including counting over 100 not-for-profit and Indigenous communities as clients, representing over $3 billion in invested assets. And in addition to strictly financial matters, Dalyce and Mike mentioned that the topic of fiduciary duties and governance in general comes up a lot. And it comes up a lot during client meetings as well as other discussions. So they do have a wealth of experience to share with us today. So Dalyce, I am absolutely honored now to pass today's webinar over to you. Welcome.
Great. Thank you, Tracy. Maybe I'll let Mike introduce himself here quickly as well before I hop straight in. Go ahead, Mike.
Sure. Thanks, Dalyce. Thank you very much for the lovely introduction, Tracy, and thank you all for joining us today. It's great to see you all. As Tracy mentions, and we would reiterate, the partnership with the Community Foundations of Canada is very important to us, and we really enjoy what we're building together. So I'm joining you, as Tracy mentioned, from Vancouver, and I'm happy to say that we're on the beautiful and unceded lands of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish First Nations. And we actually have a little bit of sunshine on those nations today, which is sometimes rare in early March. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Vancouver weather, it's nice to get sun in the winter. And yeah, so I think Tracy's covered off really where we come from. It's important to know that we do and have managed investments for foundations, community foundations, public foundations, the whole gambit, and not-for-profits across the country. Today, we're managing assets for about 110 of those not-for-profits. So we do see a lot of different information and different ways of dealing with some of these topics that we're handling and discussing with you too. So we're happy to share. And well, this topic actually is quite dear to us because we think this is a fundamental tenet to how foundations are managed and how people should behave within those. So maybe with that, I'll pass it back to Dalyce in Calgary. And Dalyce, you could just introduce yourself and we'll get on with it.
Sure. Thanks, Mike. I'm going to just switch the screen share here quickly, so bear with me just for one moment. That should look okay for everybody. Yeah, so thank you, Tracy. Thanks, Mike. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us here today. It's really nice to be back with the Community Foundations group, see a few familiar names out there in the chat box as well. So for those of you who don't know me, I am, as Tracy mentioned, a portfolio manager based in our Calgary office. And in the spirit of reconciliation, I also wish to acknowledge that I live, work, and play on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy of the Siksika, Kainai, and Piikani First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation, the Stoney Nakoda First Nation, and Métis Nation number 3. and really important. And I wish to honor and respect the authentic history of the Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta. So before we go too much farther, just your friendly reminder that today's presentation is very general in nature, shouldn't be taken as specific investment advice, but as always, please don't hesitate to reach out to us directly to discuss your specific situation as required.
Dalyce, I'm not sure about the other viewers, but I'm still seeing the opening slide from CFC. I don't see your slides if you've moved to those.
Oh,
Yes,
okay.
Mike, if you click at the top of view options, if there's a drop down menu and you just have to click Dalyce
Oh,
and then you'll see her screen.
perfect. Thank you for that.
No problem.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Okay, can you see the overview slide there now?
Yes, looks great. Thank
Okay,
you.
perfect. So for those of you who joined us for our previous webinar on February 1st, you might remember that the focus was specifically on structuring the investment committee itself. Mike and Leanne spoke to the importance of the investment committee, their main functions, some of the specifics around the investor policy statement, and then those common conflicts to watch for. So do review that if you haven't had a chance to take a look. Today, we're going to assume that the committee is intact and dive a little bit more into the specifics of the committee's fiduciary responsibilities to the foundation and its beneficiaries. Of course, you know, as Tracy mentioned, this responsibility is not specific to the investment committee, but applies to many situations. Generally, a fiduciary responsibility exists where one party is responsible for looking after the best interests of another. So as an example, as discretionary investment managers at Leith Wheeler, we have a fiduciary responsibility to our clients, and we take a lot of pride in that. We interact
but she is actually on vacation today.
Okay. We interact with a variety of investors, consultants, committee members across the country on a daily basis, and our clients do rely on us to protect their financial interests. So today, let's walk you through some of the basics of what is a fiduciary, what are the roles and responsibilities that come along with that, and some specifics around specific items like duty of care, duty of loyalty. We'll talk about some of the challenges that you might encounter, as well as the importance of a sound decision-making process and best practices to avoid any issues. And finally, actually more midway, we're actually going to provide an opportunity for some scenario discussion within the group today. So with that, I will pass over to Mike.
Thank you, Dalyce. Okay, so maybe you could just chime in the chat if you like, or you can unmute, but we're curious, how many of you in your roles with community foundations have you dealt with this term or theme, even concept of fiduciary? And you can do that as I go through this first slide, just define it. But what is a fiduciary? So Dalyce said it very well. It's a person who owes to another the duties of good faith and trust. In my very simple mind, I like to think of it as almost a parent and child relationship, not to be too paternal about it, but it's when you're caring for a child, you have the duties to do what's best for them because often they're not able to make those decisions early in life. Okay, what makes decisions that are in the best interest of the foundation its beneficiaries? And this, Dalyce will get into more detail, but this is the concept of always putting the foundation or whoever you owe the fiduciary duty to first. And that means also, most importantly, ahead of your own interests. You must act with a high standard of care, diligence, and prudence. And we'll get into more details on that. There's definitely deeper dives into that because it can be scary when you think about those high standards because you may not have the experience, but there's ways to compensate for that by using professionals or other things that you can do in your role as a fiduciary. Okay, another big one with fiduciary duties is avoiding conflicts of interests, and we'll talk about that. And we have an example we can talk through, and there's many that we see both in our practice as well as in any kind of situation where a fiduciary duty exists. And who does a fiduciary duty relate to? So depending on your roles, it's quite broad. You can be a trustee a board member, a committee member, so you may not even be on the board, but a committee member, and you will have a fiduciary duty. Now, the fiduciary responsibilities. So this is what responsibilities you have to that organization or an individual is financial, legal, and ethical. If it were me, I'd underline the ethical because that should override sort of all of your decision-making process. That should be the lens that you look through. Obligations you must fulfill because of your position within the organization or your fiduciary duty. It's imposed by law. So this is important. And when you're speaking to some of the professionals, you might ask, are they committed to a fiduciary duty or responsibility by law? Some are and some aren't, depending on the relationship. The assets belong to the organization, and the assets can only be managed through its directors, and that's what fiduciary responsibility is. So clearly in this example, the organization can't make decisions for itself, so it's the board of directors that are making those decisions, and they need to put, again, that interest of the organization first and foremost. And fiduciaries, well, I just said that bullet, but fiduciaries must put the interests owed to the other person or organization above their own. And I can't emphasize that more. I mean, that is probably the fundamental tenet of fiduciary responsibility. Dalyce, do you want to go into some of the more details on the details of the duty, or do we want to pause, see if anyone has any questions on that first segment or definition?
Sure. Yeah, I can't see any questions popping up here personally. So maybe I'll just add that, yeah, fiduciaries in general, you can't take advantage of any opportunities that will profit you in some way because of that role in this relationship. There are fairly demanding rules that prohibit that profit making and that conflict of interest. So we'll talk a little bit more about that here over the next few slides.
Yeah, and maybe just jumping back in, I can offer just an example that's Dalyce and I kind of found funny. It actually affected me in my hometown, and I won't mention the hometown. You'll have to look it up and see where that is. Interesting situation. So the city was agreed to redo the downtown corridor so that it was sort of rejuvenated with interlocking bricks, more pedestrian friendly. I'm sure lots of us have seen that in cities before, small towns. And what happened is they needed to find a contractor for these interlocking bricks to put across all the downtown form. And years later, they found out that it was the mayor of the city at the time, his own company, who supplied the bricks. And they said, well, they went through a full, due diligence RFP process to find the right person. But what was inserted into that RFP was very specific dimensions of that brick that needed to be in place for the winner. And the mayor's company was the only company that made them of that size. So to underline Dalyce's point, that this is sort of what you want to most certainly avoid. And I chuckle because it is kind of funny, but it's an example of using your fiduciary duty irresponsibly to profit to your own interests.
Thanks, Mike. So let's take a look over the next few slides at a few of the primary duties that a fiduciary has to their beneficiaries or their members. First one here being duty of care. So you can sum this up as the expectation that you're going to act with competence and diligence. Sounds fairly straightforward at the outset, but important to keep in mind. You do not have to be a financial expert to sit on an investment committee with this fiduciary responsibility. But there is a particularly high standard of care for the not-for-profit sector. And a fiduciary who breaches their duty is more likely to have punitive damages awarded against them than an ordinary person within or an ordinary defendant. So these obligations can also continue even after any relationship between the fiduciary and the beneficiary has ended. So important to keep that in mind when you're sitting on these committees is that, the decisions and the whatnot made today can have a longstanding impact. So we've got a few proposed steps here at the bottom, which can help fulfill your duty to be informed. So disclose, thoroughly review any of the proposed investment strategies that you're focusing on. Make sure you're asking and recording any questions that the committee has. Speak up if you're unsure. Don't just go along with the herd, and always seek that additional advice and guidance where needed. So bring in the experts. On that point, it's important to remember that it is perfectly reasonable to accept that same standard of care in return from any of the hired professionals that you bring in to assist with the committee. So whether that's, wealth manager, legal advice, other things, absolutely, they should be operating under that same standard.
Yeah, and the other point, sorry, I was going to add, Dalyce, is on when you're seeking additional advice and guidance where needed. The thing to keep in mind is in most of these practices, as you wouldn't be surprised, the common sense question is probably best to bring forward. And as Dalyce said very well, if you have a concern, you shouldn't be silenced. You should make sure that it's heard, and bring those common sense questions too, whether it's investment, legal, purchasing chairs, purchasing windows. Just ask what if it makes sense to you or not.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So the next slide here that I've brought up refers to what we call duty of loyalty. And this one can be summed up to the expectation that you're going to act honestly and in good faith in the best interests of the organization. So any actions that you take, as we mentioned before, should be carried out for the sole benefit of the foundation, avoiding any personal gain. And it's important to note that even if, as I mentioned before, you've engaged outside parties to manage the investments or assist in the process, your personal duty of loyalty is not something that can be delegated. And so because of this, it's important to be present, engaged in all of the matters and conversations within the committee. You should be disclosing those conflicts of interest, recusing yourself where necessary. And the team should commit to honest and easily understandable communication, avoid sharing confidential information. And as we mentioned before, hiring a professional investment manager that has their own fiduciary responsibilities is a huge safeguard when it comes to any of these responsibilities that are on your shoulders as well. And not all investment managers and licenses are created equal. So important to do some due diligence there in terms of their responsibilities. And lastly, here in the deep dive on the specific duties, I thought we would include a slide here on duty of obedience, which sits off to the side as the idea that, the committee should focus on pursuing its mission and not engage in activities outside of the scope of its purpose. So always try to keep front and center the hat that you're wearing on the investment committee. Remember how important it is to remain on that specific task. Keep that mission and the investment policy statement at the forefront. Avoid using any investment options that do not align with that overall scope, and ensure that you're not just stopping once the investment policy is in place. You're regularly reviewing performance in the overall portfolio structure. So we mentioned this a little bit more in our previous webinar also, but watch out for biases on the committee. Encourage members to be aware of what those common biases are and what their impact could be on the group or the portfolio. Okay. And we are going to head off into a bit of a breakout session here. So Mike, I'll pass it over to you to introduce the topic for today.
Okay, great. So our organizers will split us into some breakout rooms to discuss a scenario. And like with all things, the rules may seem clear, they may not, but they may seem clear. But often when you get into the application of them, it can be a little bit more gray. So Dalyce and I were just working on a scenario that we'd like you to think about. So as you go into your breakout rooms, and I'm not sure if I should post this in the message, but I'll just communicate verbally. So I want everyone to imagine that you are board members and you're investment committee members, and you're sitting there and you have a large and ongoing donor to the community foundation that you represent. And we're going to call him Elon. And he's very important to everyone. And Elon wants to get more involved with the community foundation. And he's got some ideas that he wants to introduce. One of them is, just for example, he thinks that we should just make every car in the community electric vehicle. Just mandatory, everyone has to change in their cars and drive only electric vehicle in the community. That's just one of his ideas that he thinks should be enforced. And another one is, he thought, well, why would we hold these other diversified investments? Why don't we just hold cryptocurrency? And he had a couple suggestions there. So what I'd like you to do in your breakout rooms is discuss amongst yourselves, how will you deal with this? So you can imagine Elon's not in the room there, but he definitely wants to be part of it. He definitely wants to join your board and your investment committee. And of course, his donations are important to the community. So how would you deal with this? And when we come back, we can talk about some of the problems or solutions or what you found.
Thank you so much, Sam. Dalyce, I think we've got everyone coming back here. I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Perfect. Thanks, Tracy. And Mike, maybe I'll let you give some comments about your group.
Sure. Yeah, we had a, I don't mind saying, surprisingly enlightening conversation. And if it's okay, I'll just check with a head nod. Susan, do you mind sharing some of the points that you brought up from your community foundation?
Yeah, I don't mind sharing at all. Thank you. Hi, everybody. We just brought up the instance that we had where we had someone come that wanted to sort of pay to play. And we relied back on our policies, and our policies were very clear. And we said, you know, if you come in as a donor, you come in with a donor hat. If you come in on the board, wearing a board of directors hat. And if you come in as a volunteer, you wear your volunteer hat. And we try and keep the lanes and the boundaries between those three roles very distinct, and our policies support that. So if there's ever a conversation or somebody feels that maybe they are earned influence in a different area based on the amount of time or the amount of dollars, the policies are very clear that say this is what your role is while you're over here. And so that's where we are.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Susan. I was very impressed. So I don't think she mentioned that, but it's a relatively new community foundation, and they ran into this similar conflict, let's say, and handled it extremely well right out of the gate. So there's a lot that all of us could learn from that. I think. Thanks for sharing. Mm-hmm. The other point, just before I turn it over to you, Dalyce, Peter was saying that the other thing you could rely on when someone brings up some of these suggestions is the written policies that already exist. And I think that's a really good point too. So you can present to your friend Elon and say, listen, here's our investment policy statement. Nowhere in there do we allow for 100% investment in any one investment or whatever the parameters are. And that sort of can give him an answer without it being emotional.
Great. Thanks, Mike. Yeah, a similar theme out of our breakout room as well, and getting back to those policies and written statements as that kind of barrier of protection. Interesting to note as well that this can be extra difficult for smaller foundations where you are kind of right there in the community, and the chances of having someone who's potentially wearing or looking to wear multiple hats can be greater. So yeah, important to note that as well. So I think we'll move on here, and we'll have Mike step in to chat a little bit about some of the common challenges and breaches that you might encounter.
You'd think we get used to that after 3 years of COVID, but I did forget my mute there. Okay, so we did just talk about one, maybe not common, but an interesting challenge there and a breach of duty. Here are some other points you can see on this slide. Lack of expertise or prudence, complexity and regulations. And I think Dalyce and I have both touched on this. This is not something that a board member or an investment committee member or any fiduciary for that matter, should be intimidated by. It just likely means you need to seek more advice. And again, I think Dalyce said it best. When you go to seek that additional advice, you should impose on them the same sort of fiduciary duties that you have upon yourself. Another one, self-dealing or improper use of confidential information. So this is a point where maybe those are two separate points, but self-dealing, as we said in our breakout session, you should never underestimate their own self-interest. It can surprise you when it comes forward, but we should never be unexpected because that's just human nature. And so it's best to have ways to deal with that. Improper use of confidential information. Yeah, we see this a number of times. It can be very tempting. And again, it goes back to self-interest, where you've learned, let's just say of a donor's contact details. And you might be fundraising for another cause and they seem to align and everything. You just need to be very cautious with using information that you've gathered in your role as a fiduciary to that foundation or organization, because clearly if you were to seek other donations, it might be in conflict. Strong personalities or improper influence. This is really important on boards. You want to be sure that everyone's voice is heard. There's been a lot of movement to be sure that we have diversity on boards these days, and most importantly, diversity of experience and thought, and you need the voice for those to come forward. Lacking clear priorities or vision. So I guess this goes back to our example, and if you didn't have those policies in place, it would make it harder to combat someone who's bringing forward ideas that you don't think are aligned. So it starts with the vision, building the mission statement, building those policies so that you have a framework to deal with. Conflicts of interest, I think we've covered that off. Limited time and resources. So this is, again, I don't want any of this presentation to be intimidating for anyone who's thinking of taking on a fiduciary responsibility. It's wonderfully rewarding. It is demanding on your time and your resources, and you do want to be sure that you can provide it. But often, quality people do find the time. An interesting question that came up in our office once was: is it possible for people to have too many board responsibilities? Does that become conflict? And that goes to the next point. And then poor communication. So it's just making sure that within your organization, everyone can communicate clearly and understandably. If we turn over here, this is a deep dive on the conflicts of interest. I don't think we need to spend too much time on this slide because we just had it in the breakout section and we've talked about a number of these items now. So the most important thing is being able to identify a conflict, because they can come as potential conflicts. That's the way a mindset should be. Is it may not be a conflict today, but how do we avoid potential conflicts, both in appearance and in practice? So identifying those, you need to be on your board to announce, talk about it. On a number of boards that we participate with, they will actually at the introduction ask about conflicts at the beginning openly to the board members. Full disclosure of those conflicts. It's great to be, if you've got other activities, it's good to just talk about what are my other activities. We call it other business activities, and those should come forward to your organization so they're aware of what else you're involved in, and they can assess if there is any perceived conflict there. Abstention from voting. So this is where there is a conflict or perceived conflict, and it's often best for that member, if it works, to just abstain from the voting and the discussion so that the board and the rest of the organization can carry on. That's the next point as well. And refrain from any action to influence discussion or vote. So this is, again, a very gray area because there will always be sort of consensus building or politicking within board rooms. And that's okay. It's a matter of ensuring that board members aren't taking it to another level and putting undue influence on the vote. That's a quick rundown of conflict of interest, but I think we probably should turn back to Dalyce and talk about how we can create a good, sound decision-making process.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And I did just want to share a quick example. We kind of polled a few of our colleagues before this webinar, and it's important to note that not all of these conflicts come with the intent to harm. but that doesn't change the obligation. So in one instance, a board chairperson was found through conversation to be directing all the printing business to their own company. So there's something that can come out, very innocently, but is an example of a conflict there. So hopefully you're realizing by now that there's a lot of nuance to these fiduciary standards. Something that can seem very black and white from the beginning is not necessarily so easy to navigate. So it does come back to that good governance, having those policies and procedures in place, which set the standard for accountability. And a sound decision-making process is that key component to protecting the best interests of the foundation. So, the list here is by no means all-inclusive, but it does lay out a few important safeguards. So have that mission, potentially even a code of conduct. And in the fact sheet that we have prepared alongside this presentation, you'll actually see a link to a couple of examples through the CFA Society, and a quick Google can pull up a few examples as well. Do you want to make sure that the committee is fully informed and on the same page about what that mission and code of conduct is? Make sure you're defining those investment objectives and goals, as Mike and Leanne mentioned in our last webinar. Ensure that due diligence with any manager search. And like I said before, don't stop there. Make sure that you're doing that regular review and reporting, updating policies as the needs of the organization change. And keep diversification in mind. So not only in the investment portfolio, which we're of course always preaching, but around the table. We see a lot of issues where the investment committee has a loud or experienced voice that can take over meetings. So try to develop a system that allows for open communication and encourages a variety of voices and opinions. Okay. And you can recognize a successful committee by a few of the items that we've highlighted here. There's often that specific term of reference, like the charter or the code. There's a well-constructed investment policy statement. They have an effective chair. Well, what's an effective chair? Someone who exhibits integrity. They can influence without domination. They have personal strengths because this can be a difficult position to sit in. Clear vision, passion for the work. Often there's a high degree of emotional intelligence and relevant experience, and they can be decisive and act with courage. So ultimately then committee members feel thoughtfully supported. And then again, as I mentioned before, they're committed to that regular evaluation and review. So, you really want to strive to have the right expertise, diversity, objectivity in place. Foster a collaborative environment, focus on strategic thinking, don't forget about risk management, and then remain transparent and ask for help where required. Great. And so lastly, in closing today, before we get into some question and time for questions and answers, we tried to boil this down into a few best practices. As I mentioned before, there's a ton of nuance here and it can initially feel very overwhelming, but our hope here is to make it easier on committee members to achieve those fiduciary obligations. Something that I like to do when I'm feeling overwhelmed with my own fiduciary responsibilities is remember that they exist for very, very good reasons. Keeping that in mind and the protection that they offer really helps alleviate some of the pressure that you might feel in that space. So first and foremost, understand your responsibilities like the ones we've covered here today. Maintain those clear policies and procedures. Have a well-defined IPS. Involve those experts where required and avoid the conflicts. Excuse me. Don't be afraid to do things like develop meeting assessments, and then therefore you're encouraging that continuous growth on the committee to just sit back and review where you've been and how successful you feel that meeting was. Be very mindful of the various members' strengths and diversity on the team. And down here at the bottom, which I think is really, really important, is don't forget about planning for contingencies and succession planning. You want to reduce key person risk by ensuring there's backups available Same thing that, we're doing as investment managers as well. Try to ensure that you have as much stability in those transitions on and off the committee by having a good process in place. So those term commitments and staggering that out, for example. And remember the long-term focus of many of these funds and keep that really front of mind. A new committee member is not necessarily a cause for immediate change and kind of putting that new stamp on the process. So we need to resist the temptation to manage these assets as if, they were your own, because our own time horizons and needs are very, very different than those of a foundation and long-term assets such as these. So, ultimately this all comes back to preserving the goals of the foundation and ensuring that you can all continue to do the amazing work that you do for your local communities. So with that, I think we will turn it back over to Tracy. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming today, and hopefully you found it valuable. We're happy to take any questions that you might have.
Dalyce and Mike, thank you so much, and just really, truly appreciate the level of guidance and learnings that you shared with everyone today. We do have a moment for 1 or 2 questions. So if there's any questions from anyone, please feel free to use the raise hand feature, and we can take a moment. And as we're watching and just waiting, I just want to reflect for a moment and share with you, both of you and with everyone today. I truly appreciate your reflections on that. This is also the role of the board and the investment committee. So it's really an organizational role to look deep into the fiduciary responsibilities and the importance of ongoing education like we are today, holding space to have these discussions, but also to dive deep. It is important for the board to also as well take a moment to pause and reflect on the learnings that they can include into their regular calendar and include it as a guiding moment to share as a group. So it also allows for discussion time as a group to come out during those meetings. We do have in the resource library some very important documents, and both of you alluded to this today, around having good policies, having good systems in place, having ongoing review of your duties. We do have some guides that are available to all of our community foundations that are available through the resource library, and one is our admin and governance template guidebook. And so we are going to share that in the chat here too as well for everyone, because it is a key tool to help community foundations include all of these pieces that you've noted today within their operations. I don't see any questions here. Just want to make sure I haven't missed anything.
There's a couple of questions in the chat.
Okay, perfect. Yes, I just see that. All right. So I'll just note in regards to the slide deck and as well as the recording, it will be provided to all of our attendees following this webinar in the coming days, and we will include a link also as well into the resource library, so it is readily available at your fingertips. And then we do have a discussion item that's come up here from Peter. Thanks, Susan. I just saw your thumbs up there. Also looking at evaluation and review of the investment committee. So looking at the evaluation, the review of the committee by the board or the committee on the manager. So there's a couple questions here. I see one to review the committee and aspect, and then the other to review on the managers. Would either of you like to step into this question for me, please?
Certainly, I can go first. I think, Peter, the regular review of the investment managers, presumably those external investment managers, is normally conducted by the investment committee. And sometimes in that investment policy statement, it will stipulate how often that review should take place. But good practice is sort of anytime in between 3 to 5 years, there should be a review, and it should be viewed against the goals of the policy. And that review it often ends in a recommendation by that investment committee to the board to approve or not. As far as reviewing the actual investment committee, I think that's the second part of your question by the board. I'm not aware that too many boards review their own investment committees in that manner. There is sort of definitely some inward review of how that board is composed and who's participating in effectiveness, etc. But I don't know if there's anything formal. Dalyce?
Yeah, not off the top of my head, actually, as it comes to who the members of the investment committee are.
Right.
But yeah, I think you covered that off well with regards to the investment manager.
Yeah. Does that answer your question, Peter?
I can definitely also speak in regards to evaluation of the organization. We do ask for community foundations to also do assessment of their organization, and we do have some tools. We have an assessment document that is also as well in the resource library of that is easy to access to as well. What we do encourage is for community foundations to monitor that, recognizing what the board's responsibilities are, and also monitoring the investment committee, and that the board is ultimately to hold responsibility of that investment committee. So looking at how the investment committee would report to the board, what the reports would look like, and then it allows for, as you conduct your overarching assessment, to understand if you're meeting your investment policy. Are you still continuing to monitor your conflict of interest and other policies that are in place to ensure it moves you ahead? So again, just really encourage, take a peek in the resource library. We've got some good tools to support.
Yeah, thank you, Tracy.
And I just also want to acknowledge there has been a tremendous fact sheet that's been added to the to the chat box as well today on, again, understanding the role as a fiduciary. So encourage everyone to grab that link that was shared with us today. And again, I just want to echo my appreciation to Dalyce, Mike, pardon me, and also all of the other team members with Leith Wheeler. We truly appreciate your care and guidance as we continue to nurture and support our whole network and providing the best resources that we can to help each and every organization at the space of where they are today. And so thank you so much to our Leith Wheeler team. We appreciate we've been able to offer this session and so many others, and look forward to where the future holds for us going together. And we look forward to seeing everyone at our up and coming Reconnect 2023, where members of this team will be joining us at our conference that is taking place in Toronto, June 1 and June 2. If you haven't seen the details on it yet, please do take a moment to explore our website, and you'll find some great details. Plus, we're sharing many great things through our regular communications. And so we do have a poll. Please take a moment to complete the poll. This will help us to ensure that future webinars are informative, but also of interest for each of you too as well. And again, we just invite you to join us for upcoming events. Next week, we are really honored to hold an International Women's Day event, which will be a panel discussion, which will include a meaningful conversation with leaders in philanthropy. And I can share with you, I know who some of those are. You want to be there. Please do not miss next week's discussion. What we've been doing on an annual basis is holding time to have a panel discussion around what does it mean to lead in philanthropy today. So join us for next week's webinar, or panel discussion as well, if you can. And so as well, register via the events page that you're seeing in the chat box too as well for future events, and continue to monitor the page that you see today, but also monitor my newsletter that comes out to you once a month with additional events and resources that have been created to support you in the work that you're doing. And again, as we get ready to close off today, just sharing my deep appreciation to our team here today, but also to our amazing community foundations. Thank you for your leadership in building strong communities and communities where all belong. Take care, everyone.
Thank
Thanks,
you. See you in
everyone.
Toronto.
Thank you.